Start. It's 2:30. Welcome to the panel. We are today discussing a very important issue, Russia's expanding influence on its neighboring countries. But I would like to make a very quick remark. So we are not talking about Russia's influence. We are talking mainly about the Kremlin's influence. My name is Zhanna Nemtsova. I'm going to be the moderator of this panel in the next hour. I work for Deutsche Welle. I'm a reporter and host of the program, of the Russian language program Nemtsova Interview. And I'm very happy to present today's panelists. It's an extraordinary group of people. First of all, Natalia Antelava, co-founder and CEO of Coda Story. It's an online resource that uncovers unique stories. She will give more insights on the projects in a short while. Natalia is based currently in Tbilisi, Georgia. For a number of years, Natalia was a BBC's resident correspondent, and she worked in different regions from the Middle East to the Caucasus, in Washington, D.C. and in India. And when the war broke out in Ukraine, Natalia covered events in Ukraine for BBC. Welcome to the panel. Thank you for coming. Frank Hoffman is my colleague. He's currently based in Berlin. He's a correspondent covering Europe. But well before, he worked for Deutsche Welle for a number of years in the Balkans. Then he worked in a war-torn Ukraine, and he's also the author of a number of documentaries, including Maidan Dreaming. Frank, welcome to the panel. Thank you for joining us today. Unfortunately, Oliver Vichpovich was not able to join us today because he fell ill. Hope he will recover very soon, but Frank is an expert and he can cover the Balkans as well. And Ewelina Karpinska-Morek is a journalist and a reporter. She is based in Krakow, Poland. She works at Interia. It's a large Polish internet portal. She's responsible for news section. Ewelina, welcome to the panel. Thank you for joining us today. So I will give the floor directly to the panelists for their introductory remarks, and then we will jump to a question and answer session. And in case you have your questions, you're very welcome to ask these questions. And I see that there are lots of people here today. That means that Russia is still high on the agenda, even though it's afternoon and it's 30 degrees outside. Natalia? Please.
Yeah, Russia is definitely high on the agenda. It's amazing to see how the language that wasn't popular and sort of no one was learning Russian anymore, and now in high demand and so on, and will probably continue to be so. I'll explain before I move onto the main subject of the panel. I'll explain very briefly about how Coda works. Zhanna wanted me to do it. Coda is a media organization that puts a team of journalists on one issue, on one crisis at a time. We created it, and we as a team of journalists and technologists and various people with lots of different bits and international experiences. And we really wanted to address what we saw as a problem in international news, where the spotlight very often moves on and we no longer know what happens in a place that dominated the headlines just recently. You know, there are plenty of examples. I won't bore you with that. One that I always bring is Libya, the NATO bombing of Libya, and then the lots and lots of coverage, and then the Benghazi attack, and literally almost nothing in between. So we were not very well prepared to understand the Benghazi attack if we didn't really know what happened between the NATO bombing of Libya and the event. So that's what Coda does. And when we launched with a prototype last year, we looked very hard at, picking the right crisis or picking the right right issue to start with as a proof of concept. And we ended up picking LGBT rights in the former Soviet Union as our very first issue. Not from just the human rights point of view, which it's covered massively from, and it's been covered quite well, especially around the Sochi Olympics, from that point of view. But we really wanted to understand the dynamics and the reasons behind the Kremlin's war on gays. And it was that reporting project, basically the prototype project that led us to the subject that we are covering now, which is disinformation. We are looking at the essence of Coda is very much to try to do very narrative, very much on the ground storytelling, and try to understand the dynamics of what's happening and the kind of the currents and the themes that are that make up the big issue. And at the moment, as our prototype as the LGBT project showed us, disinformation really is a force that is shaping no longer just the Eurasia, but the entire world. And we wanted to come up with, ways of showing it. And it's probably also the best way of showing how the Kremlin policies are affecting the region and affecting the discourse and the narratives and so on. A lot of what we're doing with the coverage with these disinformation stories is very much in I don't know whether it's inspired, but we're trying really hard to apply some of the lessons that our team and me in particular learned while covering the war in Ukraine. And I can talk about it more in the questions probably, but I think as far as journalism is concerned, I think the international media especially really, I think we had the Ukrainian media, which was suddenly, in the middle of a conflict that they didn't quite expect and didn't know how to cover. We had the Russian media, the government media that was under immense pressure to push the certain narrative and pushed it very successfully. And we had the international media that was the only media that was truly in a position to explain what was happening. And I personally think that we failed to do so. Very much the goal of Coda is to try to learn the lessons of why we failed, why we international journalists failed to tell the story of Ukraine. And it started with Crimea, and basically it goes back to the very model of journalism that we have today, where so much of it, it's the balance that we treasure more than anything else, and balance is a hugely important thing in journalism. And but when balance becomes he said, she said, which is what a lot of journalism is these days, then the alternative narratives that are being pushed out and the fake news manages to basically infiltrate into the journalistic narrative as well. So the best example of thing is the fact that we all used the little green man. We all used the term little green man, and no one in Crimea, there were no stories that put the face and the name and the place to the Russian soldiers who were in Crimea, right? And by doing so, I think we enhanced the Kremlin's narrative, and we enhanced disinformation, and I wouldn't go as far as to say we supported what happened, but we certainly did not give our audiences a clear picture. And I think more reporting came out later that dealt with it. I think Simon Ostrovsky's Selfie Soldiers for Vice News was one of the best examples of how you can cover fake news and how you can cover the stories like that. But, if disinformation, I would argue basically that disinformation is one of the greatest forces shaping the region and spilling over the region everywhere else. We journalists need to find better ways of covering it.
Natalia, thank you very much. Frank Hoffman, I hope you're going to speak about Ukraine, how Ukraine tries to counter Russia's influence. It's very direct. What does the political leadership do there? What's the situation in the territories controlled by pro-Russian separatists? Because the recent study conducted by Berlin-based think tank ZOIS shows that more than 50% of people who live in the territories controlled by pro-Russian separatists or rebels, I don't know what the best term, they are they want to be part of Ukraine, and that means that Russia's influence even in these regions is exaggerated.
Yeah, thank you so much indeed for the word. Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you for these wonderful guests we have here today. Indeed, that's a very interesting question, because if it's so, it's not because there's a lot of media outrage from Ukraine, from Kiev towards the occupied territories. I think at the moment this is basically an economical, that's a result of the desperate economical situation in the occupied territories in so-called LNR and DNR. I would like to give you just a few ideas for our future discussion later about my experiences I had when I was assigned to Kiev since the end of 2014, when it comes how this media fight, media quarrel, I would even call it a war on media, was evolving between Kiev and the Kremlin, and all about the conflict after the Maidan revolution. When I arrived there at the end of 2014, the first measure I was facing was that Kiev forbid about more than 15 Russian TV channels in the cable networks in Ukraine, by other means of watching these TV channels. A measure many people in the international environment there thought, well, this is not really what we think an open society, a democracy should go for. But that is a good sign for how strong this fight was from, let's say, the end of the Maidan Revolution, 2014. And this just went on like that in the war after that, in Donbass. And that brings me to the point saying that, of course, it is about identity. This conflict is about identity after thousands of young people risked their life on Maidan for a European dream, for a European idea. That's important to understand why media is playing such an important role there, because there's only one narrative that really brings all these sides in this very heterogeneous society Ukraine is. You have, of course, nationalists, but you have also a very active civil society that was the basis of the Maidan Revolution. There's one undertone that brings them all together, and that's the European undertone. And this is why the supremacy of media is so essential for the elites in Kiev today. You learned probably that during the ESC this year, 2017, Kiev lost bitterly on a diplomatic level a conflict with Russia by banning the Russian singer in Ukraine. That was no doubt about, in my opinion, a diplomatic disaster for the elites in Kiev. However, at the end, I think nowadays I understand a little bit better why they did it. I think the target group of this measurement was more inside Ukraine rather than outside of Ukraine. And it had obviously to do a lot with the struggle for identity. You shouldn't underestimate that Ukraine until today is struggling with its post-Soviet legacy. The oligarch structures come from the 1990s, after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And this is what is going on until today. The struggle also not only with Russia, but also inside the country with these post-Soviet structures. And Ukrainian media are shaping this new identity mostly following of different interests. The oligarchs, for example, they own TV channels, which is one of the most difficult things if you try to understand how media outlets in this country are working. This is why the civil society's main source is, or let's say one of the most important sources, social media, besides a few independent online portals that are still quite successful there. And I hope, of course, our program in Russian and Ukrainian. However, and I think I would like to end with this because we want to continue this discussion about this later. If you are responsible for the information, if you need information from social media that eagerly, that means also that you are very vulnerable, because social media are a matter of troll attacks from Russia, from Kremlin-financed organizations in Russia. And we wanted to talk about fake news and what you were mentioning, Ostrovsky's work in Ukraine and Russia later, and therefore I think I'd like to make a point there.
Thank you very much, Frank. So, Evelyn, you're the third one, and I hope you will talk about Russian Kremlin's media influence over Poland, how strong it is, whether you feel it or you don't feel it, and whether the Polish find this information reliable or not.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure for me to be here and to have opportunity to talk about such important subjects. A few words from me for the beginning. Well, we are living in very interesting times. We are witnessing information warfare led by Russia in very sophisticated and frightening way. We notice in Poland, in other media, the presence of trolls, of course. Well, yesterday we were talking about fake news and trolls and propaganda. So if we are talking about Polish media, there is the presence of trolls is noticed by us, especially in the space below the articles, when there is space for comments. For example, a few days before I arrived here, I published 2 texts about Russia, and then I checked comments below the text. And of course, there were some pro-Russian comments, some against Russia comments. But if you are a reader, you can quickly notice that there are slightly difference in talking about subject that you are interested in and talking about subject that you have to be interested in just because you are troll or person who got money for writing such things. And I think that information warfare has got a geopolitical background because Putin is trying to build a zone of influences in the neighborhood of Russia, with the Moscow in the heart of this huge multi-story construction. And information became very dangerous weapon, as we could see, as we could see in a case of Ukraine. Information is very cheap, is accessible. There are no obstacles like borders, so it is being used like a weapon nowadays. What is more, Russian information warfare is not going to disappear, and there is a Putin's strong vision of domination in Eurasia, and he is focused on a rivalry with the West. But I think that the most important thing and challenge for us as a journalist and for media in general is to understand that this propaganda, this information warfare exists, and then try to research that, checking the information, and then helping people or the societies who are most vulnerable to the propaganda. So in my opinion, we should regard Russians not as our enemies, but in a way as victims of their country. So here are my starting point.
Thank you very much. I have a question for Natalia. You're now based in Tbilisi. We all know that Mikhail Saakashvili lost the election back in 2012, and the new political leadership is regarded as Kremlin's friendly. How Georgia deals with Russia right now, and what the perception of the Georgians towards Russians?
I think it's very hard for politicians to be Kremlin friendly in Georgia. Actually, not as hard as we thought. Turned out during the very last election, because most Georgians are very aware of the fact that Russia occupies 20% of the Georgian territory. But I think, and I do think that Kremlin failed in 2008 in getting its objective. I think it learned very important lessons and adopted them in a very, very impressive way. And I'll never forget kind of the difference between sort of the Russian tanks in Gori in 2008, where you like literally thought you were in the Second World War movie, kind of hungry looking, miserable 18-year-old soldiers on rusty tanks, and the scenes from Crimea where they looked like US kind of Navy SEALs, like amazing sort of recalibration in a very short period of time. So I think there was this, but I think ultimately, Kremlin didn't get its objective of getting rid of Saakashvili, who was pushing, Georgia very far from the Kremlin's sphere of influence by conducting very successful, very controversial, but very successful reforms. He was creating a functional state that had plenty of problems, but was basically giving people an alternative. However, I think Kremlin has succeeded since, and it has succeeded, and I think in Georgia, Russia has a particularly hard sell because people are mostly anti-Kremlin. B, there is no Russian-speaking population to protect. And there is, long history in kind of the national character of this kind of rebellion against and so on. But I think Kremlin has been incredibly successful at pushing certain narratives through the channels that it had available to it, like the church, like the various groups, traditionalist groups, the Orthodox Parents Union, various priests. And a lot of these narratives were mirrored completely the ones that were pushed by the Russian state media, but they never referred back to the Russian state media in the beginning. And I think that partially, and I think the opposition, utilized also, look, there are two things. That's not why Saakashvili lost the election. Saakashvili lost the election because people were fed up and because, an alternative came up. But I think we have seen in the last parliamentary elections in Georgia, we saw the Patriots Alliance, which is not, again, very openly pro-Russian, but it adopts all the narratives that Russia adopts. It's very anti-gay, extremely xenophobic, extremely, they label themselves as pro-Georgian. We basically say we're not pro-Western, we're not pro-Russian, we're pro-Georgian. But their narratives are identical. And pushing this narrative, that's why LGBT, I think, is a huge story, because they manipulated masterfully the people's, the inherent kind of traditionalism of certain societies. And I'm always amazed by how I hear the same stories from people that I talk to, whether it's in, Kutaisi or Luhansk, where, I remember this guy at a demonstration in Luhansk telling me, what do you want? You want Europe to come so that they force you to marry a woman? I'm like, you really think that? And people really think that. And I remember talking to, Georgian priests who tell me, look, we can't be with Europe because they really are, they have pedophiles in power now. And it's stuff that's very traceable. You hear these narratives on millions of weird Russian sites, but also sites in Czech Republic and Baltic states and, I don't know, sometimes the state media in Russia as well. And they all want one of the things, like the anti-Muslim sentiment. We recently ran a story about the anti-Muslim sentiments in Czech Republic that has almost no Muslims. Like why?
Natalia, I would like to know what's the role of Russia right now, how the real leader of your country, Mr. Ivanishvili, deals with Russia. And is he under some sort of control of the Kremlin?
Well, officially, I don't know. Like last time I checked with him, he wouldn't tell me. So, but this is a man who made all his money in Moscow and who sold his Gazprom shares to become the prime minister, which a job that which he quickly resigned from, while still holding on to power, which is a bit of a problem. So you don't. It's kind of hard to sell your Gazprom shares if you don't have some sort of connection to the Kremlin. But I don't think it's Ivanishvili that poses the real... I mean, Ivanishvili is a massive, danger to democratic development of Georgia, which is now ruled basically by kind of a godfather figure. But I think the narratives, I think what's much more effective, and Russia has always been very effective at identifying certain politicians and working with them and making it very hard for journalists to trace it, because so much of it is, a lot of it is not even money. I was just talking to a journalist from Armenia who was telling me that she met with this EU ambassador, and the EU ambassador was telling her, look, I just don't understand it. We've spent millions and millions, and Russia has spent almost nothing, and yet they're the popular ones here, And I think the Kremlin is just very good at identifying and using the existing characters and pushing the message that really resonates. It just presses the right buttons in lots of different societies. And I think this is how it's winning. It's winning the Kremlin narrative is either winning or really muddying the narrative of the kind of the liberal world because of, it presses the right buttons. The same way sorry, I'm talking too long, but make one more point. It doesn't just apply to the former Soviet Union. I think we did this, we talked to over 100 Western RT fans, people, Americans and Brits who watch RT, who go to RT as their choice of news. And we asked them, why is it? What is it? And we kind of, they were very common trends. And one of the things that they all said was, I'm pissed off with the Western media because of the way they covered the Iraq war. And that's what made a lot of people turn to RT. And that's another example of how, that Moscow is very good at pressing the right buttons and using the grievances or sentiments or, feelings.
Frank, you talked about the fact that Ukraine banned a number of Russian TV channels, including TV Rain and RBC TV, where I used to work. But how strong is Russia's influence right now in Ukraine, for example, through loyal oligarchs, loyal to Russia, I mean?
I would like to pick up what you just said, and that answers the question, I hope. Of course, it's a system of pressing buttons, but it also means that, if it's only that, it's quite easy to tackle with independent journalism, with the belief that the way to the truth is the right path, and this is what we should do on a day-by-day basis. And that's important when it comes to the oligarchs. Obviously, there's a power struggle between President Poroshenko and other oligarchs, especially Akhmetov and his influence in the eastern occupied territories, where is he obviously struggling a lot at the moment. And that tries to give you the answer. They are losing. Poroshenko is the only one who became richer since Euromaidan. The former owner of Privatna Banka lost the control of the bank because he lost the game with Poroshenko. He wanted to have a bank that's the most important one in the country, and hop through the pressure of the International Monetary Fund. He lost the bank because the central bank took control over that banking structure. What I want to say is that Ukraine is probably not a full 100% democracy today, but it's not what it used to be coming out of that post-Soviet legacy. So it's a progress, and the more Europe, the West, but let's stay with our continent here, the more we as Europeans just do what our duty is as journalists, as democratically elected politicians, then Ukraine has a chance for further transforming itself. I don't see any other way. The idea that power politics work like we have to tear Ukraine on our side because there's the Kremlin, this is 19th century thinking. This is exactly what Russia wants, and the Russian elites want us to think at the moment. But this is not our future, and everybody who has the time to think a little bit about it, and our recent European history since the end of the Iron Curtain will understand it after a short period of time.
Frank, what do you think? How do the Ukrainians perceive Russians right now?
Depends to whom you talk to. When I left, and that was at the end, I did this documentary film, Maidan Dreaming, most of you probably haven't seen it. It's about the other Ukraine. It's about the music scene, electronic music scene, which is quite strong there, like all over Eastern Europe since it marched through, I must say, sorry for that, Berlin after the end of the Iron Curtain, after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And it's very popular there amongst young people. If you ask to the young designers, if you speak to people that are active in art, there's no Russian influence there. But there's also not a pure defense. There's the wish to solve this problem on a democratic basis. It's just a question how strong is that part of the society in a situation where still the economy is struggling, where this war is hindering Ukraine to really reform itself stronger, faster, to have at the end of the day positive economical results. We just saw it with the former, with Mr. Saakashvili who moved from Georgia to Odessa to transform a very important structure there. The whole area of Odessa is economically very important for Ukraine because it's the gate to the Black Sea, and a lot of trade is going through Odessa. However, he failed in a way that it's somehow clear that the old structures, post-Soviet structures, prevailed and defended itself. Let's see how long this will go on. But it's an ongoing struggle. So I hope you're asking me what's their perspective of Russia to Russians at the moment. It's a little bit like that. I mean, they know that they cannot leave geographically, and in the same time, they don't. Many people I talk to, let's say 90% of the civil society, it's not that they are just blocking Russia. They want to have the debate, and they really, as far as I understood, make a difference between Russia, Russians, and of course the Kremlin elites at the moment. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. Evelina, Andrzej Duda, president of Poland, is perceived as a non-democratic leader, and he and the Russian leadership put some hopes on him because he was Euro-skeptical. What is his strategy towards Russia right now?
To begin with, Polish President Andrzej Duda was a few days ago visiting Croatia, and there he was asked if we should soften or calm down Europe's dialogue with Moscow, and he said no. He said no, and the reason is that that the situation in Ukraine hasn't changed, because if Poland is thinking about relationships with Russia, there is always Ukraine somewhere in our heads. And as he said, there is no goodwill to improve the relationships on Russia's side, to improve relationships with Poland. Russia doesn't want to stop its Russia, Kremlin or Putin doesn't want to stop its aggressive behavior towards countries in Eastern Europe, and he doesn't want to stop intimidating other countries. On the contrary, there has been a very significant increase of increase in the number of heavy equipment delivered from Russia and placed in the areas that are controlled by separatists. So again, Ukraine in our heads in thinking about Russia. What is more, I'm just thinking about data that were in the report prepared by Polish Institute of International Affairs. While France, Germany, Italy or United Kingdom are decreasing the force readiness, Russia is behaving quite opposite way. For the last decade, Russia is increasing this force readiness and exercises some scenarios of large-scale conflicts in the OSCE area. So it's so different behavior than the Western European countries. Of course, we can discuss the subject of Iskanders in Kaliningrad region. There are many other tools that are used now by Kremlin, by Putin to show the power and to intimidate other countries. But all of these tools I mentioned are the part of aggressive politics, as Poland see aggressive politics of Russia. Polish president told also in one of the interviews, it was in 2015 after election, that Poland didn't want to be a buffer zone between Russia and Germany, and in the same time he asked NATO for help for some bases in our country. So on the one hand, we have some military issues. We have conflict on Ukraine, war on Ukraine, and then we have emotions and feelings that are mainly negative because of our history, because of some common points in our history, because of Ukraine again. And of course, these emotions play very important role in the relation between Poland and Russia. We also have quite fresh memory of being dependent on Soviet Union. So it's probably still in our heads and in thinking about relation with Russia. We witnessed some gestures. I'm thinking about 2012 now, when two churches, from Polish side and from the Russian side, signed a document called Common Message to the People of Poland and Russia, and we thought it would be a historical breakthrough in relationships, but it wasn't. Probably some Russians also hope that it can be a breakthrough, but it wasn't. So it is nearly 5 years from the 2012 when the document was signed, and nothing positive has happened. As some historians, Polish historians said, because Kremlin didn't give green light to the Russian side to improve these relationships. I'm describing these subjects a little bit shallowly. Sorry for that, but there are many issues to talk about, so I'm trying to catch some subjects because they are relevant if we are talking about official attitude of Polish president toward relation with Russia. If Poland doesn't want to soften the dialogue with Russia, we have to know the background. Why is it like that? Polish president regularly emphasizes the necessity of strengthen the eastern flank of NATO. This subject appear in many discussions with different partners. But as our president says, not only military fraternity is important to us, but also some kind of brotherhood of principles, brotherhood of values, coherence and solidarity among the countries that are in NATO. So not only military issues. We need something more. And during Munich's security conference, Duda underlined that there is no chance of for abolishing sanctions against Russia until the Minsk agreements will be fulfilled. So again, we are thinking about Russia in the context of Ukraine.
I think we have to give the floor to the public. If you have any questions, please. Yeah, please.
Hello, I'm I'm from European Economic and Social Committee, and I will start by saying that immediately after annexation of Crimea, ESC was the first institution which approved the document deconstructing Russian propaganda, and then we warned all European institutions that we should fight this info wars because it's very dangerous and tendential. What I would like to say that I think speaking about Russian influence, it's a very huge mistake to speak about it as it would be only in eastern countries or only in neighborhood, because we shouldn't forget about Russia influence in all Europe. Russia today, Putin's mouthpiece, 700 million viewers in the world. Sputnik is broadcasting in 30 languages. Russia is heavily investing in these media outlets. If I'm not mistaken, it's $3 billion per year to keep up these channels very popular and to translate everything to German, French, and other languages. I think there is no hotel room in Europe which wouldn't have Russia Today channel. And of course we give very tasty narrative. We give you information you will not get in CNN, BBC, and what is not translated, not broadcasted by others. So my question is, what is the role of traditional media competing with such channels as Russia Today, which in my view should be marked as fiction, because people should know that we are watching not real news, we are watching fiction.
Okay, thank you.
But
I did not.
But in reality, it seems now that traditional media is playing chess, and Russia Today is playing checkers or football under the same rules.
Thank you for your question. Okay.
Not everything Russia Today is fiction. That's. I don't think most of things that are on Russia Today is fiction. I think Russian government has its right to have Sputnik in 30 languages and, you know, do what it does. I don't think we are in a position to change that. You know, they have, but and I think it's really, really important to understand why they do have 750 million viewers in Europe and in Western Europe. But I think at the same time, I think what the traditional media should do, and that, you know, goes, I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, is what Russian media is very good at is creating, and maybe not so much RT, but I think traditional media needs to find more compelling ways of putting their narrative across. Just in the same way that European institutions need to find a more compelling way of putting their narrative across in countries of the region, for example. And I think that's changing, and I think we might have Brexit and Trump to thank for the change that, you know, you can feel. I think one of the best things that happened during Emmanuel Macron's campaign in France was that, you know, they outsmarted the whistleblower, the WikiLeaks. You know, they leaked fake emails. Fantastic. And finally, some creativity from, you know, the Western liberal world. I think there needs to be more of it. And I think as far as journalists are concerned, I think, you know, we don't have to betray the principles of Western. That will be the last thing. You know, I understand why Ukraine banned Russian TV, because that TV is fiction, you know, because I've spent a lot of time, I don't know, in Slavyansk, where I would like wander around the streets and then come back to the hotel room and I would see a war and buildings blowing up in Slavyansk, allegedly, where, you know, allegedly near exactly where I was, and they were not blowing up. The Ukraine, so I understand, but I think it's such a slippery and dangerous slope to start banning channels or banning free speech. I think all of Western institutions, including the media, should be more creative and more focused on getting their narratives and getting their stories across and finding better stories. And I think and be more committed to telling the stories that are important. I don't really believe in debunking stories, because I think it attracts more attention to them. I think we need, you know, that's why I brought up Simon Ostrovsky's film, or, you know, the work that Bellingcat has done in Ukraine. There are powerful ways of showing that the Kremlin lies. And just very briefly to address in the very beginning, I said, you know, there is this problem with he said, she said. And I think because Western media is obsessed, rightly so, with balance, I think balance is very important. But I think when balance comes with shallow coverage and shallow reporting, then it feeds disinformation and feeds fake news. And when it comes with kind of more in-depth, more committed, more nuanced reporting, I think, you know, it doesn't. So I think traditional media organizations should be doing more of that. And some of them are starting to do more of that.
Frank?
I think another issue that is important to understand is that in many Western European countries, Eastern Europe is still a box unknown. Even 13 years after the Big Bang and the enlargement of the European Union towards the East, we are facing times where the European project is in its most critical crisis since 1957. Our currency was tackled by the markets for about almost 10 years now. We are at the end of a 10 years Japanese decade in the Eurozone. And of course, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding, and I've been traveling through most of the Eastern European countries now. There's a big misunderstanding in Eastern Europe that the Western European countries, the core countries of this European Union, needed a long time to come to this point where they are at the moment. And again, 2004, most of Central Eastern European countries became part of the European Union. A little bit later, Romania and Bulgaria. That's a big bite to eat at the end of the day. And I think we have to bring each other a little bit of more of understanding of the needs to the other side. Coming back to your question, I think Europe reacted very briefly to the questions of fake news and trolls financed obviously by the Kremlin, with creating Stratfor, a body close to the European Commission that is analyzing so-called fake news and giving the facts and everybody who wants to have that can have that newsletter just by inscribing there. So there's a reaction towards that. And to your point, balancing out is one of our bases. The other one is to do our job properly, and that means we have to do research on both sides of the subject that we are covering. And if we continue to do that, again, what you just said, I find very important. This media squirrel that is going on at the moment is a lot about pushing easy buttons. You don't like Muslims, they are Muslims. You should better take care that they are not more. They are none. You don't like gay and lesbian people. Obviously, in these countries, the scenes are not very vital. I'm very happy that just 2 days ago in Kiev, again, there was a huge, the biggest LGBT demonstration ever since that started, because that's an important issue. And I think we have to push ourselves as media people, as journalists, but also when we talk to the decision makers, that these are crucial subjects where Eastern Europe still is on a path of discussion, on a path of change, of changement. For example, you were just mentioning, Evelina, that in the whole NATO debate, Poland was asking for more troops. Well, the troops are there now. A lot of people in France, in the Benelux, and elsewhere in Western Europe are asking, what is said about the abortion right in Poland? What is the narrative this conservative government after the Tusk government now is prolonging? What's about Mr. Orban in Hungary, in Budapest? These are not values most of the European unions in these core European countries are sharing. They don't. Anti-Semitism, like it's happening in Hungary, is a no-no, but it's happening. So we have to talk about these issues and not let them be taken away by propagandists that are fulfilling the division, which have that goal of dividing Europe, of dividing us as Europeans as well. We have to think much more about the fact we are Europeans, we are sharing common values, and we have to think about them before we're listening to that, what you were just outlining, pushing easy buttons, I think you said. I like that. I like that expression.
More questions?
Good afternoon. My name is Christian Spar. I work with Konrad Adenauer Foundation. Very interesting panel. Congratulations. I have the feeling that on the one hand we are good at analyzing fake news and trolls and disinformation. There is a European Commission working on it. There is NATO working on it and others. Frank Hoffmann just mentioned one initiative from European External Action Service. But on the other hand, I don't think that we are, as European Union, very good in pushing the right buttons and telling our own narrative in a compelling way, in a way that addresses both facts and also emotions, people's emotions. And in that regard, I would like to know from all the panelists about Ukraine, about Georgia, about Poland, where do you see good examples for telling a better narrative of Europe in your countries? And also, where do you see good examples about countering fake news, fact-checking initiatives or other projects that help people to understand the true facts?
Well, I can start very briefly because I was talking so long now. You know, I've been recently to I was observing demonstrations in Bucharest against an obvious, very questionable government who's trying to implement laws that will take the guilt of corruption off them. I've been to Budapest. I observed the demonstrations supporting the Central European University there. All over there, I see young people that are really believing in this European dream in Eastern Europe at the moment. And I have the feeling that one reason for that is that they are following, or what they want when it comes to media, a certain objectivism, and they don't want to have propaganda. They don't want to have or I put it the other way around, I think this is our narrative, that people want to have independent media that are covering the way many quality media outlets in Europe are doing, and not what they get from others, even also in their own countries. I find this as a very positive sign, and I think maybe we should talk about more about it, and also in Western Europe listen more to these people. I mean, I find it impressive. The demonstrations for the Central European University are still ongoing. The media hype is a little bit on a downscale at the moment, but it's still ongoing. As well, the discussions I call it the Generation Erasmus in Bucharest. And again, there were demonstrations in Skopje, in Macedonia already last year. And the result is that there's a change of government now. So things are happening very often Western Europe doesn't really want and doesn't really talk about many circles there.
You know, I think I mentioned that I don't really believe in myth busting. I think they're really amazing. People like Stop Fake have done some in Ukraine have done some incredible work, and I think these initiatives are really important. I mean, fact checking should frankly be part of any journalism that's put out there. I think when we think about things that feed disinformation and feed propaganda, I mean, propaganda is a different thing. You know, propaganda has always existed, but the lies and disinformation, I think, you know, the oversaturation of opinion on all main, I mean, that goes back to the question about what traditional media should do. Maybe have less opinion and more reporting. I mean, that would be a good start. You know, maybe be more committed to places that are covered in bursts when something big happens and then are completely abandoned. Maybe do more, you know, Russian media, Russian television in Russian language tells some riveting, amazing stories. You know, we need to find better stories to tell, not, you know, except theirs are often, you know, Russian state TV, Россия сегодня is fiction. Well, but there are good stories to be told that are not fiction. We should be just going in a sense, I think, in terms of journalism, we should be going more to the core principles of journalism, to a little bit of, you know, the more old-fashioned journalism. And we should be trying to get out of the echo chambers more, and we should be trying to reach out to and figure out why the 750 million watch RT, and what is it that makes them watch RT. And you know, one of the things I think it is scary and unfortunate, and I think that what's really under true assault, not just from the Kremlin, but from so many authoritarian governments all around the world, and from so many movements, is truth. You know, and truth happens to be kind of the founding core principle of Western liberal democracies as well. And we have to find a way of making truth sexy again, you know? We can't do it by just presenting people with facts. You know, we should be learning from American TV series. We should be learning from Hollywood. We should be learning how we better market ourselves and tell better narratives. And I think that's really important. And I think that would be great if there was, through that, maybe there will be more cohesion of, you know, I think academia is, you know, part of it. I think awareness, you mentioned awareness and how important it is, the awareness is of that disinformation existing. And, you know, and I'm not talking just about media literacy, but I'm talking about, I don't know, you know, hiring people who, you know, journalism students in Western universities should not want to go and join RT. They shouldn't want to do it. Or in fact, TRT or Press TV, you know, true journalism, again, should become, you know, great again. We need to make these core principles of the liberal world sexy and attractive for people so that they don't run off and work for the people who have agendas other than truth when it comes to journalism.
I think that we became some kind of experts in Western European countries of seeing fake news. Of course, it's irony in a bit, but we have problem with researching this area, because we see what is happening, but there is no enough good research of that. So maybe idea of organizing common structure or organization which will be responsible for checking and researching that on the European Union field. Maybe there is the way. And I think that fact checking is a fact in some traditional medias, but we have social media, and I think that's the problem. Because people
that's sure. I mean, Facebook and Google and algorithms, and that's a whole different issue.
because I think that people who are the real journalists and feel the responsibility for presenting information, they stick to fact checking, and I think it's quite normal. But the problem are social media. Well, that's the future, but there are so many opportunities to present some information without checking any facts are alarming, I think.
Sure, but the positive side of it is that I think the media literacy is becoming something that we're much more aware of. We're much more aware. I mean, I still talk to people and you say, where did you read that? And they say, oh, I read it on Facebook, you know. But I think we're learning, as societies we're learning. And, you know, I think drunk driving is a good example of how, you know, decades ago, two mothers whose sons were crushed and, you know, started campaign against drunk driving, and they, you know, I don't know, a campaign think before you tweet, you know, and I think that's kind of emerging and coming as well.
Our panel is over. It's 1 hour. Thank you very much for being with us today. Thank you very much for your questions, and I hope you'll have more time to answer questions after the panel. Thank you very much.
One, two, three, four. My name is Dimitri. I work for BBC World Service, and thank you very much for the invitation. So today I wanted to talk about some of the subjects which constitute some of my work, some of my day-to-day work, and I just wanted to share some of the thoughts about how editorial can use some of the automation techniques that different media organizations are using in journalism. So I'll probably will talk for about half an hour, and then we can leave some time for the questions afterwards. So is there a clicker here, or? Right, okay. So I work for BBC World Service, and my job is to be a digital editor for 28 languages that BBC does news in. We are quite a large portfolio. We're reaching about 137 million people across all our platforms. And just to put things into perspective, in the last 5 or 6 years, I remember when this portfolio was about 15 times smaller. So we are growing, and we have really big ambition to reach 500 million people by the BBC's centenary, when BBC becomes 100 years old by 2022. And our job as digital teams for languages to contribute 1/4 of it. So we will need to be reaching, instead of having that number, this is a monthly number, we need to convert that number into a weekly number, which is, as you might appreciate, not a very easy thing to do. But we're also launching 12 new language websites in the next several months. So more languages for India, more languages for Africa, more languages for, well, we're relaunching Serbian service, and we're going quite heavy to Africa and India as well. Does it work? Thank you. And obviously there is a huge opportunity to grow. A market is absolutely enormous, and we're expecting another 1 billion people to be online within the next few years, and the majority of them will be coming on mobile phones, overwhelmingly mobile phones, and the majority will be coming from Africa and from Asia. So we think that we are quite well placed to keep growing. And despite all the new things that is happening in the market, despite all the new technologies and techniques, what I would say is content is still the queen. People normally say content is king. I'm a feminist, so I say content is queen. So I'm thinking that whatever you're doing, you only will be as popular as the content you produce. So when I was asked to come here, I was thinking I could come and talk about all sorts of things. I could talk about digital content strategies. That's what I do for the majority of my time. We could talk about innovation. We can talk about 360 degrees videos, VR, AR. We can talk about social media optimization, all those types of things. But this is basically what I do on a daily basis. And this is what all media organizations are doing on a daily basis. And I thought, well, let's not talk about this, and let's talk about this. So this is T-300, and T-300 was the Terminator that was sent to kill John O'Connor, if you remember, from Terminator. So we were thinking, what if Terminator arrived to Earth without looking for John O'Connor in Terminator, but with a big desire to become a journalist, or help journalism to become better somehow? And obviously this is all kind of the background story to this is that robots are taking our jobs, and people are afraid that robots are taking our jobs. I keep hearing from some of the editorial teams I work with that robots are going to be the end of journalism, and what are we going to do? Well, not really. What we are talking about is we're talking about how technology can help journalists do a better job, or free up some time to be better at what they do. So there are 3 things I want to share with you this afternoon. One, there are 3 projects which my team was involved in the last couple of years, year and a bit, and I wanted to share how they went, what have we learned, and maybe open it for later discussion. So one project is what can we do with synthetic voices in journalism, what can we do with automated translation. The second thing is newsbots, and how newsbots can help journalism reach more people. And the third thing is how can we automate things within journalism workflows so we can, again, free up more time or produce more content faster. So let's talk about the first one. And before I go into the first one, what I wanted to say is that basically the best things happen in journalism these days when you get people, when you get a team like mine, for example, which sits on the intersection of various disciplines. The most interesting things are happening when journalists, technologists, and people who actually can pull them all together in one direction can work together and achieve great things. So this is how it is organized at BBC News. We have a team called BBC News Labs that I work with a lot. And BBC News Labs, they sit on the intersection of three areas: journalism itself, data, and technology, software engineering and stuff like that. So the innovation part happens where those three different disciplines meet each other. So the first thing, let's talk about voice synthesis and automated translation. About a year and a half ago, we were thinking, what can be done using voice synthesis and automated translation, whether the technology itself is good enough to be able to, I guess, to be able to be as popular as the human-created pieces of content. We just wanted to see what the tolerance level was within the audience itself. And we wanted to understand how good the machine translation is, and we wanted also to understand whether the tolerance levels of the audience to synthetic voices, what kind of tolerance levels we're talking about. So how many people are using here Google Translate, for example, or Bing Translate? So it's great for some languages, it's absolutely amazing for some languages, it's absolutely horrible for others, right? So we are not saying that what we were doing, what we were outputting without a human intervention. I'll just explain what exactly we did. The idea was obviously BBC is producing content in English. BBC is producing a lot of content in English, and we're thinking, what if we could use the English language text or English language voice, then transfer that into text, translate that text automatically from one language to another, then get some human, i.e. a journalist, get inside the translation, type it up a little bit better, and then apply synthetic voices to that translation, and then have the same video at the end with a different voice. How will it work? So we spent about 6 months creating a content management system which looked roughly like that. And we ran two live pilots, one for the BBC Russian service and one for the BBC Japanese website. And the reason why we chose two different services, we wanted to see what will the audience of the Russian website, which for BBC Russian website is in the top 5 of the biggest language websites we run. I used to be the editor, the digital editor for the Russian website many years ago, and we always knew that there would be some pushback from the editorial team to use that. We always knew that editorial would always have lots and lots of things to say about how bad the voices were or how bad the translation were. And we just wanted to figure out how we can bring that change and what the change is going to be about. And then we used the Japanese website, and the Japanese website was only the website with very limited resources, which was operating in a very competitive market. But the interesting thing was the tolerance level of the audience to robots and anything to do with automated technologies was much, much higher. Meaning that we were almost expecting the Japanese version to be a great success right from the start. So what you see here is you've got the English translation, English text on the left, and then the automated translation of the Google and other providers available, obviously, to do the automated translation. Then a BBC Japanese producer would come in and would change some of the translations. And then if you see the drop-down menu with the names at the very bottom or very top there, you can actually assign automatic synthetic voices to that translation. Once you have assigned the automated translation, then the back end of that system did their job, and then at the end you had exactly the same video from the English voice you had the Japanese voice. And the beauty of it was that it always remembered when the English voice started and the English voice ended, so the narration. So the Japanese metadata kept exactly the same in and out, and you would always the system always would indicate to you whether you are over or under for that particular bit of time. So we did that, and this is roughly the structure of the team. So I was running it as one of the projects in my team, and you see we had editorial coming from BBC World Service, that's me, strategy and use case for that and funding. We had production operations team, people, the engineers and others, they have come up with the idea. So they had the idea and the vision and the production expertise. And we also had BBC News Labs to help us with software development and prototyping. So it was a 3 people strong team working together for about a year from start to finish. And that includes the public beta version of that as well. Interestingly enough, the reaction was overwhelmingly positive. Interestingly enough, the reaction was not actually quite different between Russia and Japan. So people were saying, thank you for offering this, because we on the Japanese website, we don't have enough videos. And now what we always wanted to say is that this is not about getting rid of existing journalists. This is just about adding more content for that particular audience with automated translation and voice synthesis. That's it, nothing else. And interestingly enough, we obviously wanted to check that with focus groups in the country, and we brought it to Russia to actually see real people, so what real people would say about this. And but I'm obsessed with data. I'm obsessed with measuring everything, and I always use that phrase. And if you heard me speak before, you might have remembered that I always say that a person without data is just a person with an opinion. So kind of if you don't have data, then it's really hard to have a conversation with you, because it's going to be I like that, but I like something else. So it's not practical. So we wanted to see and measure what was the audience impact of these videos. And interestingly enough, the completion rate for every automated video was roughly the same as the completion rate for the video with a human voice at the end. So that meant that the tolerance level for that, even in the Russian market, which was expecting much, much higher quality than the Japanese, because I think Japanese nation generally is accustomed to robots being around them in a much bigger way than people in other countries. So. But it's interesting, it was quite positive. So what we have done since is we have enabled 3 or 4 more languages, and we have been working with some off-the-shelf providers of existing languages, of existing voices. Some voices are great, some voices are better than others. But what we are now doing as a second stage of the project, we would like to create our own language, our own voice library. So we want to go into the areas of the world where commercial providers would never be interested in or creating voices in. So we are actually thinking of creating our own proprietary BBC Swahili synthetic voice. And we ran a hackathon about how to create that voice. And interestingly enough, a team of developers ingested a Bible reading in Swahili inside the computer, and they created a voice on ability to speak or ability to read the phrases within 2 hours. So it wasn't great. It obviously needed lots and lots of additional work, but the fact that you can just ingest a piece of reading or a piece of text, somebody reading the text, and then what you can do is you get all the phrases and syllables and consonant and vowels and everything else, and then you can start creating a synthetic voice, which is an incredible area, given that all the big tech companies are going into voice activation software like Alexa and Siri and stuff like that. So we definitely see a lot of potential there. The challenge will be to actually understand how to metadata everything, because it's one thing to ask Alexa to give me latest news, but what about can we make our content as meta-taggable so Alexa can actually understand if I ask her a question, give me the latest on Manchester attacks from BBC Radio 5 Live, and then would then need to go and do all the calculations and give you the best possible audio available. So that's the first one. So the second one is BBC Newsbots. So Newsbots is an interesting area because they are only as good as your marketing of them. Because you can do, I mean, bot technology has been around for, I don't know, a couple of years, especially since Facebook Messenger opened it as a platform for all eager people to create news bots. And we have done 3 or 4 so far for all different areas of BBC News. And I just wanted to, we just wanted to answer that question. We wanted to figure out how can we leverage the technologies to reach new audiences on messaging platforms and social media. So that was basically our, it is still basically the question, and because we are running some of the bots, we keep improving them. So well, there are easy bots, like for example, the election bots. As soon as the state is declared, then you can generate a result and an image, like with Hillary, for example, and Nevada slide there. Or BBC Mundo bot is the one which my team is sort of editorially responsible for. So BBC Mundo, Spanish language website for the BBC, is the largest and most successful language website which we have at the BBC. They reach about between 20 and 25 million people every month. They are serious, big operation. So we wanted to figure out what will happen if we will introduce Newsbot for them. So Newsbot is pretty similar. So morning in Latin America, 7 o'clock, 2 p.m. London, you are pinged a link by BBC Mundo bot saying, hello, good morning, these are the top headlines of the day. And what you can do, there is an option of 4, and you can swipe between them. And you can read each of them, and then you can forward each of them. And then if you are interested in more, you just write, more más noticias, more news, and it will send you more for stories. It's fed off the front page, so it's almost, if not endless, but it's kind of, you can still have a nice chunk of an update around from there. But what we have understood is that obviously the 25 million people using BBC Mundo website, and it's a huge, huge audience. They probably are getting several million of them, maybe 5-6 million of them off social media, and only, I think, 3,000 or 4,000 subscribed. So the challenge is to actually explain to people why it is needed and explain to people that there is such thing is available. So we're trying, before we start proper marketing campaign about this, we're trying to make this bot more intelligent. We're trying to make this bot react to some keywords, give me more news on sport, give me more news on Trump, give me more news on latest on Middle East, something like that. And then it will, we tag our content with as many tags as possible, and BBC Mundo probably will have simultaneously running 300 or 200 streams of grouped content. So if you wanted to have stream of news on medicine, you can have one. If you want to have one on women, you can have one, and that would be an interesting thing to see how people interact with bots in that way. But the overall numbers are small, I understand that, but the really interesting thing is that the engagement level of a person who gets to interact with that bot is huge in comparison with the general engagement on the website. So people stay longer, read longer, share longer. That's quite interesting. So on a bigger scale of things, if we were to expand it, then potentially, you know how hard it is to drive engagement for any news website to get it from, I don't know, 2-page views to 3-page views at any point of time. It's really, really big challenge. So we're seeing that potentially bots can help us with that. We also have done 2 other bots. One was an explainer bot on BBC Politics during the election, and it was a Brexit bot explaining people things and offering them content based on our Brexit coverage. But then during the election, we basically switched, the team in BBC Politics switched to answering questions about what was happening with general elections in Britain. So that was quite interesting. It was quite hard to find a conversational tone. It was quite hard to understand how BBC needs or must sound in a bot environment. We're still getting there. And the 4th type of bot which we have done was a quiz bot, which normally occupies or normally accompanies some of our big projects and big seasons that we do regularly with editorial teams. So this particular bot was a bot on the season which was called So I Can Breathe, about the quality of air around the world. And it offered audience a chance to answer the questions about the quality of air and pollution around the world. Right, so we're running active bots on Facebook. We did bots for Twitter, and we also have a Telegram bot for BBC Uzbek service. So that's the only language bot which we have for Telegram, which was interesting because one of the things which we just kind of landed in my inbox last week was that BBC Uzbek service got back to me and said, like, the bot stopped working. Why? Nobody could quite understand. So the developers went in and started to figure out why, and then figured out that the bot was initially registered to a particular mobile number, because you have to have the bot associated with a particular mobile number. And the developer who created the bot left the BBC and left and went with the number. So the bot needs to be rebuilt from scratch. It probably will take an hour to rebuild, but still, kind of, it's one of the things which you didn't even consider to start with. So the reason why we're doing it, we're trying to, you know how it is, 80-20 rule, obviously, 80% of our business is usual coverage, and you always want to have kind of 20% of your time dedicated to something which you haven't done before. And we're trying very hard, obviously, like everybody else, to reach people on social media using absolutely different types of things. So the things which we learned so far is that it's not a traffic driver by any stretch of imagination, but it's interesting as an experiment. So, and another thing, like engagement level, is something which is very encouraging. Right, and automation scale. So this is probably the hottest topic at the BBC at the moment, especially at language services where I work. So imagine, like all the great things, the majority of things happen in somebody's garage where somebody just codes something and then it becomes really, really cool. So I had a friend at the Russian service who, well, he's left like a few years ago and went on to do something else. And he was thinking about how you can automate a reversioning, which is a term how you can recreate a video from one language to another without touching a video itself. Like without downloading it, uploading it, rendering it all the time. How can you take, like, all social media friendly videos have one thing in common. They all don't really rely on natural sound. They all have subtitles around it because people read subtitles. Right, okay, so you've got a video and we have started producing, like if you have heard about BBC Shorts, which is a format which we have created for Instagram before, just as Instagram allowed a video functionality, and we have become quite trailblazers in that sort of area where you create a video, upload it, and it basically tells the story only using subtitles, but the narration is not there. So we thought, right, okay, that's English, but how can you immediately make that video available to 28 other languages without any of those languages in Nairobi, Jakarta, Bangkok, Singapore, and others, without them actually downloading initial video or recreating it, uploading, rendering, that sort of thing. So how can you do it automatically? So the key questions we want to consider is how you can add efficiency into the project. I mean, imagine if Trump wins White House and then there are 40, well, I've told you, 28 language services we have now, and we'll have another 12 by the end of this financial year. So by March 2018, BBC will be doing languages, news in 40 languages. So how would you avoid the situation where 40 digital video journalists on the morning of the Trump elections are doing exactly the same video about Trump winning White House? That's 40, 80, 160 hours of joint work thrown away, just like that. Like, why would you do it? I mean, you can't argue that the Indonesian version of that clip and the Russian version of that clip should be completely different. So we want to understand, right, BBC does X number of videos which are good enough for all languages which we do. And I guess the biggest thing why we have been growing so far is that all our language services are growing because of their original content, because of the quality of the central offer from the BBC, but also from the original content they do. So we wanted to free up time from individual language services from doing those things that can be just repeated or I guess, scaled automatically so they can do more original stuff. Right, so this new system was created, which was called Stitch. BBC has this long tradition of naming internal content management systems by the cartoon characters, and our old CMS used to be called Top Cat, and this one is called Stitch. Obviously, it's, you know, the name stuck because obviously you're stitching something together. So it's incredibly easy system to do. So you've got the interface is quite simple. It is connected to Adobe After Effects. The front end is in front of the editors. Editors come into the system, and there are already videos which are uploaded by one person. It takes about probably hour and a half to upload one video into After Effects, do all the work which is needed to be done, so it appears in the front end. So all what the language services, Arabic or Russian or whatever, needs to do, they just need to come into the system, retranslate everything, all the subtitles that were there initially on the English clip, press the submit button, and then in a couple of minutes you've got the video, exactly the same video, but with your own subtitles. So it has become so popular that we are currently averaging about 700 to 800 videos created by all language services a week using that system. So the economies of scale are already quite evident. But what we have found out, and this is the biggest challenge for all organizations where journalism and tech are connected, so they appreciate each other. We definitely appreciate each other. My job as the digital editor for languages is to be the owner of all language sites at the same time, and I have my counterpart who is a product manager for all language websites. So we talk and we make all our product-related decisions together based on editorial considerations and product considerations. But what organizations are struggling with, and I think it's not only typical for the BBC, is to create something in the beta environment or as a pilot environment, and then for the large organization to take that product on as an official product with 24/7 support, with all these things that basically kind of, if something falls off, then who do you call to fix it? So we are now in the process of migrating this from a from the trial environment to a proper BBC product environment. So that was quite an interesting thing. So it takes about 5 to 10 minutes to make a video with Stitch once it has been uploaded there. Another 15 to 20 minutes to upload and publish it into your content management system. So basically what we're saying is a person without digital video skills, if you have a shift within every language service which only recreates those videos, you can create about 10 videos a day from one shift without actually using your capacity of your fiber optic cables going into the studio now, into the office and out of the office. So that's quite impressive, because again, going back to Trump example, the way I explain this to journalists is that imagine you have 10 videos at any point of time. Your first video is Trump winning White House, which is a central video created once and then recreated by everybody, because him winning White House is a story which basically kind of is fine for anyone. The second video can be an African story, which all 12, we'll soon have 12 languages in Africa. All 12 languages in Africa can create one video about Trump's attitudes towards Africa, just general, what is Trump policy about Africa should be. That video can be created and then redone through Stitch as well, and then all 12 services can use it again. And then if you are in Nigeria, for example, and we'll have 4 languages in Nigeria very soon, then you suddenly can use your editorial resource of those digital video producers who are skilled digital video editors to tell a story about Trump attitudes towards Nigeria, for example, if you wanted to. And this is what we mean by, if at any point of time all 40 language services have 10 videos to choose from, we would expect half of them to come from that central system and powered by that central system. Obviously, the look and feel will be the same. People always say how great Al Jazeera videos are, because you can easily say that they come from Al Jazeera because of branding, because of style, because of everything else. So we have recently introduced the BBC guidelines for digital video as well. Red colors, white text, all that kind of stuff. And it's interesting, 150 videos already are done by 28 services a day using that system. So just to finish it off, as I started, the great things really happen when you have that system in place where journalists and technologists and all of that underlined by data and measurements all come together to, there is everybody tired of the phrase fail fast and fail fast. No, it's fail fast, but then iterate afterwards, immediately afterwards, make it better if something doesn't work. So that's it from me. Thank you very much. Questions? Yes, thank you.
Yeah, sorry. So my name is Anita Kapska. I work for Deutsche Welle, Ukrainian department. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. My question is, what do you think? How can we get our users to get engaged with these bots? We don't use bots nowadays. I think it's very interesting, but I don't understand how can we motivate people to use it?
Well, I think if I knew answer to that question, I probably wouldn't be working where I work now, frankly, because it's everybody's after exactly the same question: how do you get to people to engage? So there is one thing which I wanted to still want to do with languages back at the BBC, is that I just well, first of all, you need to let them know that there is such a thing. And us being a public service organization, we don't tend to spend too much money on marketing because we just like that. So we do spend money on marketing, but not that much. So we will need to be quite innovative or imaginative in the way we promote those things. So thankfully, lots of language services at the BBC have their either radio or TV parts or formats. So we do lots and lots and lots of cross-promotion. So that we promote digital things on TV all the time. So you can create interesting trails and ads and stuff like that. You can also go to in every story you can create an elegant product solution where every story will automatically have an inbuilt paragraph promoting something new for that particular service. That's why BBC Hindi has become a really popular app, because they have introduced a workflow where every journalist copy and pasted a paragraph about the availability of BBC Hindi app at the end of the article. And their app is performing better than those services that haven't done it. So I think it's just letting people know why. Ultimately, it's always the question is, what value are you bringing people? And I guess what we're saying is, if you are inside Messenger and you're spending hours and hours and hours on Facebook, then you might as well get news from a credible source which you trust. Well, it's from a completely different subject area, obviously. But so two answers. One answer is that, for example, for the Twitter election bot, it was only built to show you the results of your constituency where you have voted. So you just put your postcode, and then you will be shown all the results about that. So that if you're on BBC front page, you can put your postcode, and you will be your area of your local news will be defaulted to that area, either London or Manchester or something like that. But answering your question, this is something which I'm going to talk in Vienna tomorrow at the Global Editors Forum. It's about Global Editors Network meeting, where we do a lot of editorial change management work with individual teams to make sure that their coverage is as balanced as possible in terms of not deprioritizing any big subject areas that audience in that particular part of the world really needs from the BBC. We have identified 6 really important user needs that all members across the world of all audiences want, of which, interestingly, Update Me as a need is only one. But then you've got lots of more others. And so that means that basically the best services we have treat the coverage as fair to other user needs as possible, rather than only concentrating on one. Like, we are in the news business, but it is clear for us as BBC Language Services that we are competing against local players in every market. We don't compete with people like, with other international organizations with multilingual news services. For us to be differentiated from those competitors, we need to be doing one thing, but really, really well.
Thank you for your presentation. Michael Gostkiewicz, Gazeta PL Poland. I have specific questions about the QuizBot, because the quizzes are something which brings my publisher a lot of money, and they are currently testing the QuizBot. So first of all, what was the response you got with the QuizBot? Was it an enthusiastic one? Did the people engage in this gameplay, or
it was the best of them all? It was in terms of engagement, the completion rate for those quizzes were fantastic. They were like in 90% of people who have come to the bot completed them. So they were very, very engaging. Because there is one thing about bots generally, is that I generally feel that, have you ever seen Quartz news app, where it is built like a bot, Quartz. Yeah. So it's built like a bot, right? But the trouble is that it takes too much time for the bot to come back with an answer. And that's the most annoying thing about bots, that they take some time, and sometimes it feels a little bit gimmicky. So you need to make sure that the bot is built as fast as you can. And quiz is a nice thing because you still want, psychologically, you always want to understand how you got there. So it's a great format.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we're run out of time, right? Right. Well, thank you very much.
We're waiting for a few more people and then we'll close the door. Okay. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. Handling trauma in frontline journalism, that's what we're going to talk about in the next hour. But before we start, and I introduce my panelists to you, I would kindly ask you to take part in a small experiment. Please close your eyes just for 1 minute and listen to my words and see what images come to your minds. 3-year-old Aylan Kurdi from Syria drowned in the Mediterranean Sea, his body washed ashore. 9-year-old Phan Thi Kim Phuc, running naked from the scene of a South Vietnamese napalm attack. Omran Daknish from Aleppo, shell-shocked and covered in dust, sitting in an ambulance. And Sharbat Gula, the green-eyed woman with the red hat scarf from Afghanistan, living in a Pakistani refugee camp. You might open your eyes again. I would argue that most of you just visualized the exact same images. Maybe you don't remember the names of the people I just told you about, but the image is something that might haunt you forever. So that's the power of images. And today we want to talk about how pictures like these affect us, and most importantly, how do they affect their creators. So let me introduce my panelists to you. If you already had the chance outside to see the exhibition, you already know what they're doing, what their work is about. Let me introduce Capucine Granier de Fer. She is a French-American freelance photographer. In the past years, she's been focusing on the conflicts in Ukraine and in Iraq. Her work was published in newspapers and magazines such as Paris Match, Le Monde, the New York Times, or the Washington Post. Welcome, Capucine. We've got, yes, you can have an applause. Patrick Tombola is here with us today. He is an Italian-Australian freelance photographer and filmmaker. Patrick's most recent reporting focused on conflicts in the Middle East and in Latin America. And Patrick, you published in the New York Times, Time Magazine, Stern, Die Zeit, or Vanity Fair. Welcome so much.
Thank you.
And it's also my pleasure to introduce to you Gavin Rees. He's the director of Dart Center Europe. For those of you who don't know the Dart Center yet, it's the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma is a project of Columbia Journalism School. It's basically a resource center and a network for professionals who are dedicated to changing how media are dealing with trauma, tragedy, and conflict. And Gavin is coordinating and implementing the center's work across Europe, and above all, you're a journalist yourself. Welcome. Let me start with you, Capucine. Do you draw motivation from the idea that one day you might take a photo like the ones I just described, a photo that is shaping collective memory?
I don't, not necessarily actually. I just, I'm just interested about some stories and I just want to document them, but I'm not waking up every morning and telling myself I want to do this iconic pictures. I just want to do my pictures and be there when it's happening. And
how about you, Patrick? What drives you? What motivates you to put yourself also in danger when you're working?
For me, most of the time, it's the people I photograph. It's almost like photography. It's an excuse to have access to their lives and the unique, I don't know, just the uniqueness. So for me, photography really just becomes, I'm not someone that has almost a fetish relation with photography where I just pull apart photo cameras and everything. For me, it's the psychology of sharing that unique moment of intimacy. It's them allowing me to share that moment, the unique moment of intimacy. And I think my way of thanking them is by trying to do the work that I do as best as possible. So yeah, that's what I try and get.
I suggest we have a look at your pictures. there's kind of a slideshow, and there we see some of your pictures. I guess all of them were taken in El Salvador. Patrick, please tell us about what are we seeing?
Sure. Actually, I think perhaps two of them are from Indonesia as well, from my very early work. Well, in Salvador, it's a very complex situation. I became interested in it through an assignment, and then just started spending more and more time there. And now I've been back and forth for the last 3 or 4 years, at least 5 or 6 times a year. I think what I'm most interested in is the cycle of violence and how generation through generation violence is, again, just sort of a narration, like that. You know, they've had a dictator, then another long dictatorship, a civil war, and off the back of that civil war now gang violence. And so on the one hand is like how each generation sort of cannot almost break free from the chains of the previous generation. And I mean, this is something that's very true for many other places, but it's sort of a low intensity war, but people don't live it as a low intensity. They live it as a game changer. And I think that I really wanted to go there to show the complexity of how violence, but also how some degree of attempt of normality exists in a conflict situation. So, you know, how people try and break away from these chains in their own way.
This may be a question that you will often hear. Are you not concerned for your safety when you go?
Well, most people think that going to a conflict area means you just wake up in the morning and you just go. But in reality, I mean, being a photographer, like being a journalist, and most people in the audience can relate to that. Probably I spend 3% of my life taking photos. And then, well, unfortunately, 40% is sending emails, as most of you can empathize with that. But a lot of it is actually gathering information, talking to my sources, reading, you know, in-depth articles on what the safety situation is like. Every time I go from A to B, I try and talk to someone that's already been in B, is already in B, someone that is along the way. So, I mean, we're not cowboys. It's a very calculated risk. You know, perhaps one that people that go out partying on a Saturday night without necessarily enough money to grab a taxi, they don't put that in account. They probably risk a lot more than we do. And also the fact that, you know, who you have in front of you is in such a dire situation that you just almost don't really. It's a new normality, you know, when people are dying all around you, what you kind of feel inside doesn't necessarily feel that relevant, because someone is just, you know, it's almost like normality is just on such a high peak that by you being scared, you kind of don't even feel it. It's more when then you go back, or when there is a lull, you know, when there is a sort of break. That's when you feel it.
We're going to talk about the risks a little later on and what can be done to minimize those physical and mental risks. Capucine, maybe you can tell us a little about your work in eastern Ukraine. I mean, that's a conflict that is still going on, even though it's not in the news every day now. But what took you there, and what are you particularly interested in that conflict?
Actually, I went there just before the conflict started. Russia annexed Crimea, and in eastern Ukraine, there were just civilian people going in the street. They were strike. They were asking to do a referendum. So at the beginning, I just thought I just wanted to feel the situation. So I actually, I was supposed to stay 8 days, but I stayed 2 months and a half because it turns into a conflict. So I decided to document it daily. And I was actually really, for me, it was the conflict was the closest to France and Europe. It was different than a religious conflict. So politically and intellectually, I thought it was a really interesting conflict to to document. Actually.
You were also there to document the aftermath of the MH17 plane crash.
Yeah.
A plane that was on its way from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur and that was shot down.
Yeah.
Tell us about it.
Actually, I was already in Ukraine for
It was
2
in
weeks.
2014. Sometimes it's actually a long time, 3 years ago. Yeah.
So actually, I was already there for 2 weeks. It was a really quiet day, and I was with another photographer, and we were even saying like, "Whoa, like it's such a quiet day, nothing's going on." And we got a call. At the beginning, we thought it was Ukrainian military plane who was shut down. And then suddenly I got 3 calls from my sister, like the guy from Paramatch called me like twice. And he actually told me like it's a civilian plane who was not shut down at the moment, but who crashed. So we just arrived on the scene, I guess, maybe 2 hours after. That was, I don't know, that was unreal, truly unreal. Yeah.
I mean, you must see things that most of us wouldn't want to see, even on television or even if it was not real. How does it affect you emotionally, psychologically?
Actually, when I arrive, my idea is that I would only saw some part of the plane. I couldn't imagine I would be able to see all that bodies and walk through them. And the first actually body that I've seen was a small boy, I guess, 4 or 5, completely naked. And I remember I realized I'm gonna see like a lot of bodies. So I told myself, now you're gonna stop thinking, you're gonna do your pictures as much as you can. And I also try actually to protect myself. I didn't want to take pictures of people where I can see the open eyes or faces. So I was watching a little bit if I could see like that the body was, you know, like, so I could go closer. And but actually I know like I spent 2 hours on the scene. We stopped at the gas station, and when I went out of the car, I couldn't feel my legs anymore, and it's the first time it happened to me. And I talked to a psychologist. He told me it was the shock that. So I knew, but I mean I'm okay. Now it's okay, and.
Let's bring in Gavin. Gavin, you're working a lot with reporters, traumatized reporters, and from what you've just heard from Capucine and Patrick, especially what Capucine just told us, can you give us a better understanding of what trauma is, how it is caused, what are the symptoms?
Yeah, so kind of good place to start is to make a distinction between a traumatic situation and a potentially traumatic event, and trauma in the sense of people becoming traumatized. We use the word traumatized a lot, but basically that's probably a shorthand for long-term enduring difficulties, kind of psychological difficulties, adjusting after something's bad that's happened. But it's important to be more precise about these things, because if you're in a traumatic situation or a potentially traumatic environment, where there are dead bodies and you're witnessing dead bodies, what happens is that the body's survival mechanisms kick in very, very fast. They're 5 times faster than conscious thought. So the massive adrenaline release that you get, the cascade of stress hormones, happens before your brain has registered consciously, I'm looking at a dead body. So these are evolutionary systems that are designed to protect us. And what happens is our brain goes into a kind of altered state. Sometimes people may experience hyperarousal symptoms. So that means very wired, aware of peripheral movement, taking in huge amounts of information that could be essential for survival. Is there an attacker in the distance? Where are they? At blindingly fast speed. Sometimes what happens are hypoarousal symptoms or reactions in which the body decides this is a really big situation. It might be better to play dead and to cut off lots of vital functions. So if you see an animal being stalked by a predator, it might kind of fall asleep like a possum. And so probably when you were talking about your legs feeling weak and the body kind of shutting down, is that there's that kind of survival reaction. And that may sound a bit weird. It's like, why is that helpful? But it can be very helpful. It might mean that you're less likely to be found. Also, if people are being sexually assaulted, then those kinds of reactions may prevent people getting damaged by the attack. So it's there for a reason, but it's all a bit beyond our control. And most of the trauma reactions we have are fabulously useful, like really good. You know, if you have an exaggerated startle response in an environment in which there may be snipers, brilliant. You want to be reacting very fast. The difficulty happens is if they don't subside naturally over time. So you can imagine a soldier coming back from the front 4 weeks after leaving conflict, and then, you know, a tin of baked beans falls off a shelf, and they find themselves jumping over a counter, you know, and sort of kind of trying to
back to you
trying
later,
to hide.
yeah.
But the point is, it gets back to you later. But rather than kind of awfulizing this, we need to think about it as a process of adjustment. What happens when people get into long-term trauma difficulties is that reactions continue in a place where you're safe and you no longer need them. But normally it takes time. So if people are in very kinetic, frightening situations, it often takes a while for us to kind of calm down our stress responses, because unlike animals and chipmunks, we are meaning-making creatures. And meaning really affects how we respond to trauma, and we have to try and make sense of things.
I mean, we've just heard your stories, which are stories from the front line, but actually Dart Center Gavin is saying that 80 to 100% of all journalists are being confronted with trauma-triggering events throughout their career. That's an incredibly high number. Where does it come from? Lots of journalists in their careers will experience trauma, and so it's part of the work, and that makes us more vulnerable in the sense that we maybe experience a lot of trauma, but also, as Capucine was saying, that there's and Patrick too, is there's a process of having a job and a professional role and thinking, well, how am I going to distance myself from this? How am I going to frame the picture? And I don't know if you'd agree, but lots of photographers say they'd much rather be there with a camera than without a camera, because it provides a context and a way of making sense of those big experiences. So we have advantages as well as risk factors too. But this number then would probably include journalists who are watching material that you're sending to newsrooms around the world. That's also something that can trigger trauma, maybe.
Yeah, well, it's similar.
Explaining the number, yeah.
No, actually, it's things like local journalists reporting car crashes.
Yeah.
And you think, well, it's a car crash, but that could be the car crash in which the people died are the children of a neighbour or somebody in the local community, and that can be very traumatic, especially when children are involved in things. But the new threat, if you like, is traumatic UGC, which is flooding into the newsrooms. Now that's just plain weird, because you've got people sitting in front of a computer screen in somewhere in London watching traumatic images of barrel bombs from Syria, and then their bodies are going into trauma reactions because their body was their survival apparatus. Way predates the invention of high definition TV. So physically they don't know they're not in Syria, but intellectually this is ridiculous. Why am I reacting so extremely to this material? Because it's obviously happening a long way away. And that can be very uncomfortable in an office situation in which there's no context for it. Yeah.
Patrick, you've repeatedly, when we talked on the phone and today, you're saying, I'm fine, I know myself very well and how I might react. But from what Gavin is telling us, the symptoms, etc., does that sound familiar to you? Do you experience similar things?
Yeah, I'll give you a very easy example. On my way back from Syria, the last time I went on a holiday to decompress, and I was sitting on the seat at the back of a car, and all of a sudden my hands started sweating like beyond control. I could just see the sweat, And I just couldn't figure out why. I mean, I was fine. I was with my friends. I was like, what's going on? And then it would subside, and then it would come back, and then I just couldn't figure it out. And then I did figure it out, and I was on the back seat with the window down, and the sound of the wheel reflecting on the footpath, that was the same sound as a MiG, as a Russian MiG, kind of like coming down to drop bombs. And that's exactly the sound that I was, trying to hear all the time in Syria, because that was the biggest scare, was, the out of nowhere, you just hear this thing coming down and dropping bombs. And so I do relate a lot, but that for me is quite a natural reaction. I think what scares me the most is when even more subtle things affect things like personal relations, whether that might be love relation or other kinds of relation. And I do notice that. I do notice that, like the inability to commit to a relationship. In many ways, I reconduced it to an inability to see sometimes a future, because maybe exposed to conflict, you tend to just see the here and now rather than the long term. And then also each one of us responds to it in a different way. So whilst given statistics, I do feel represent reality, but it's such a complex reality because we're all such crazy creatures. And I was just saying before, the Finbar, decided to stop working, or decided to slow down after the Gaza conflict, and we're there with him in 2014, and actually that conflict was the one that made me want to cover more conflict. So my reaction, because I had a lot less years than him on the job, because I'm a different human being, because I have different, for him it was like right and sort of a rival point. For me, it was more of a trampoline. So
he's another famous photographer. We're just talking about him outside. But you were also telling me that 6 of your close colleagues died on assignments in Iraq, in the Central African Republic, Ukraine, and all those conflicts. And that does affect you a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. There's absolutely no doubt about it. It really does. You try and kind of make sense of it, and the closer it gets, the more kind of you bond with other colleagues of yours. I think that's something, for me at least, it's super important. Like other colleagues, other people that do my same job. Like if some of my closest friends, if I put all the days that we've seen each other, we probably have seen each other like 20, 30 days at most, around war zones and blah, blah. But with them, I feel like I've known them for, 20 years, because you live and somehow you support each other through these tough moments. And that's a coping mechanism that for me was essential.
Thank you so much. I guess we got an understanding of what trauma can mean, how it can come about, what are traumatic, potentially traumatizing events. Gavin, please tell us, what are you doing at Dart Center to help traumatized reporters, or maybe to prepare them for their missions?
I think what the principal aim of our organisation really is consciousness raising, and so giving people some kind of practical insight into what's happening. I mean, one of the things that is often a problem is that it's hard to distinguish unpleasant, edgy, natural reactions that will happen in the instant, that, as I was describing, that are really useful, with stuff that's actually more worrying and could mean that people need to take a step back, think a bit, and possibly access help, i.e. when people are in trauma trouble, because there is this difficulty that these reactions are very useful and they're kind of helpful. And one of the things that can be very destabilizing for people is essentially if they think they're going crazy when they're not actually going crazy. And that can kind of make you more crazy if you think, why am I being like this? I have no context for it. So encouraging folk to do what we're doing now and come together and have a discussion and own the issues, and also think through collectively what the solutions are. And so people can provide support, journalist to journalist. Sometimes it is a question of finding external support like the Dart Centre, or psychologists who are trauma clinicians and trauma specialists, that can be really useful for people who are in a very bad place and need help. But before we get to that, it's just the thing about encouraging people to look out for each other and to maybe point out to a colleague that, that's, you're drinking at breakfast. Why are you drinking at breakfast, And so sort of looking out and finding a way of talking about these issues collectively is very, very powerful. We know from the research into who does well in traumatic situations that one of the biggest indicators of resilience is the degree of social support people have.
Capucine, what are you doing? How do you prepare yourself for your missions, assignments? Is there anything in particular?
No, I mean, I know exactly the people I'm going to be with. Every situation, I'm trying to know what kind of risk or level of risk I'm gonna take and what I'm gonna be able to bring back, because being in a shitty situation without even taking pictures, I mean, that's not worth it at all, and it's piss you off like most of the time. So I'm trying to do that. I do think I'm not doing conflict all the time. Now I'm working on another story which is in Paris and has, so I'm trying to balance it. When I was in Ukraine and I get tired after 2 months and a half, or I'm not gonna push myself too much. I'm like, okay, just go back home, stay a little bit, and then when you feel it, you go back. And I never force myself to do whatever or to go to a situation I don't want to go. Or
I mean, media organizations such as DW, for example, offer trainings to their employees. For example, I did one with the German Armed Forces that prepares you for basically the physical risks that you might face, but they're not really dealing with the emotional aspect. And Patrick, I think you mentioned something really important earlier, that there is a huge difference between being employed at a media organization and being a freelancer. From what you've said, I got that sometimes you feel like you've been left alone dealing with your assignments.
Yeah, I mean, and with this, I don't mean to, accuse editors of anything. I mean, it's just the reality of the media industry. The fact that, with some editors, sure, I mean, they might send me an email and say, are you okay? I have to say, not just because I'm in Germany, but I found that the most supportive editors are German. And they're really aware of trauma and also of the conditions of work. But yeah, the reality is that they, as soon as your assignment is finished, they might be looking at another 17 or 20 stories on the go. So they just don't have the physical time to go, hey, are you okay? While if you are employed, you go into your workplace and there's your buddy next to you going, hey, you've just come back from Iraq. How was it? And that how was it, in a way, is a bit, especially between men and especially between sort of Anglo-Saxon men. There's this sort of thing. How are you doing? It's not really like. There's a sort of level of macho. It's not. How are your feelings today? It's not really like that. And but that's sort of a point of like, okay, he's asking me, what am I feeling? So I might just give him a bit of a. And I've always been very open with how I feel, and
you give an honest answer.
Yeah, absolutely.
You could openly say, "I'm shitty today because."
Yeah, absolutely. Like once, I had a breakdown, and I went to Gaza, and I felt a lot better because I was feeling so crazy inside that I went to Gaza where everything was crazy, and I felt a lot better. And I did say that to my friends, and they were like, "Oh, okay, fair enough." I just felt normal because they understood exactly what I meant. So no one can really understand you the same way that people, that do the same job and have the same dynamics. To say, respond as well to what Capucine was saying. I instead don't have her same sensitivity in the sense that I tend to dig myself to the ground. Like, if I feel like I'm burning out, I go further, and then I crash, and yeah. Well, I mean, I haven't. I might have learned now, but I think it's a tendency of people that do our thing to like when you feel like you're getting out of control, you just go fifth gear rather than just slow down, because slowing down feels panicky. That's my experience.
Everybody has a different strategy dealing with it.
Yeah, they do, and I think they're all instructive. I mean, one of the things is that journalists, photographers, tend to be kind of high achievement types and get a buzz out of doing work. And so we always joke about, alcohol addiction and drug addiction and these kinds of things as being threats for journalists. But also work is addictive. So every single time that you file a new story and you press send on the computer, you get this feeling. That's a shot of dopamine. It's like you get a little kind of dopamine biscuit. And that's the thing we have to talk about, that if one's coping strategy for dealing with traumatic work is to do yet more traumatic work, then that might not be always the best solution. But I hear very much what you're saying about this thing about if that you're feeling aroused and like a little bit crazy, then it makes more sense often to be in a conflict zone, because you have a context for being there and you have the altered state that fits the conflict zone. But at the same time, we also need to be a bit careful that we don't spend too long in those altered states, because then if somebody gets very aroused very quickly and they see danger everywhere, after a while it's actually hard to know what the real danger is. And so that means that people could be in like a violent, dangerous place where there could be attackers, but if every shopkeeper looks a bit weird, then you start to discount it and then just go, oh, no, it's okay. And then you can't see the real guy with the gun. And similarly, if we get burnt out in the sense of apathetic and not really connected to our feelings, so it's fantastic, I think, to have that monitor, that internal monitor going on in terms of how you feel. That's also a risk, because then what does it matter? Everybody's dying. It's all the same kind of thing. So trauma reaction is also connected to making good safety decisions as well.
But I mean, we are seeing a changing media landscape, and especially mainstream media are trying to save money, are reducing costs. From your perspective, are they doing it? Are they saving money on important issues like safety, mental, physical safety of their reporters? Is that something that you observe?
Well, it's a very mixed picture, I think. So you have news organizations which, by and large, taking these issues more seriously. They don't necessarily do such a good job of trauma awareness. I mean, you do a hostile environments course and you get a little bit of trauma component, but that's a quick conversation, and it might happen after you've just been doing a scenario in which somebody kidnapped you and put a bag over your head and threw you into the back of a Land Rover. So it might not be in the best frame of mind to kind of hear that. It's good, actually, we've got Elizabeth Kantensch from ACOS here, which is an initiative that's got a lot of industry support to try and encourage news organizations to give the same protections to freelancers as they give to staff. And hopefully that will also raise the level of protection they give to their staff and freelancers at the same time. But that's about the importance of taking training seriously, and the importance of paying, these good folk on time. Because in your doing stressful work, you don't need added stress, like thinking, can I pay the rent? Or, can I get my air ticket back? All this kind of stuff. It's really important that we own this collectively.
Is Capucine, Patrick, is there something that media organizations, the magazines you're working for, they could do better to make you guys feel better, safer, better protected on the ground? Is there anything?
I don't know the answer, but I do know actually that most of the freelancers have to pay for their own gear. Means, for example, I didn't have. It cost like 2,000 euros. I bought actually an old flak jacket from the previous Iraqi war because I only had $300 to put it inside it. So honestly, lucky me, I never received any even small bullets or whatever. But everybody like would tell me like your flak jacket is dead because we have to pay for our own insurance daily. Because most of the time we're just paying the tickets and we're going with our money, and then we're trying to get some assignment. Because as a young freelancer, it's easy for the magazine to put you in assignment if you're already there, because they are not responsible. They're not taking the responsibility to send you out there if something happened. So it's kind of, so yeah, I guess there's a lot to do, and there's a lot to do with the basic. I mean, material, good material, or...
Yeah, insurance.
Insurance.
I mean, this is...
Because there's, if you're asking a freelance, like, okay, you have to now put 500 euros in an insurance, but you need this 500 to pay the fixer or a small hotel. He's going to choose for the hotel because he wants to be out there, actually. So.
We have about 20 minutes left, and I saw that there are many questions. And before we are taking those questions, let me end this first part of our discussion on a somewhat positive note. I'd like to ask the three of you for your top advice to clear your mind after a tough job. Is there anything you do or you could maybe recommend?
Maybe the scientific advice first, and then we see how that clashes with the reality.
Okay, there are lots of things you can do to empty your mind. Things like meditation, grounding techniques, safe space, visualizations, all this stuff are used by emergency service workers working in stretchy, difficult situations. The thing about meditation, though, is you want to, and mindfulness, is you want to practice it in a safe space and then build that skill. Otherwise, it's a bit like learning to swim when your boat capsizes in the middle of the ocean. So you want to do some preparation beforehand. Also, really important things to do exercise and de-stress the body and eat well, and not just after assignments, but during assignments, because that really, when we get tired and we've not eaten well and we're dehydrated, then we become really pretty bad at processing distressing stuff. So the basics, I think, are really important.
Yeah, for me, I mean, I'm an ocean person, and I try always after a tough assignment to go anywhere where there's a large body of water and pretty much do what Gavin is saying, but not necessarily, sort of structuring and like, now I'm going to do meditation. No, but it's more just like just looking out to the sea. Lately, I've been trying to spend more time with the people I love and not necessarily feel the need to like tell them what happened, because I know that most of the time I'll either make them feel weird, or I'll make them feel like they need to say something, or whatever. And so just that routine for me is quite important, because it gives a bit of a structure, something I've learned in the last 6 months. So that's my pearl of advice for myself.
Yeah, I guess it just come back to my daily life, and usually I feel like enjoy more the day after. I don't know, I go out, I smoke a cigarette, I go to a French cafe and just enjoy, and I breathe, and I'm like, yeah, I'm alive, and that's, yeah.
So one quick hot tip, actually, is remember to do all your washing and your washing up before you go away on assignment, because coming back to
there's another mess.
A kitchen that's a disaster is pretty destabilizing, I'd say.
Thanks. All right. There are questions. I saw you. Please, and then later.
I'm Naveed Ahmed, and I'm a Pakistani who has been based mostly in Middle East and North Africa. I've been covering for international sources, Atlantic, Post, and Al Jazeera English and Arabic. There are two things I want to say. It's reporting conflict and reporting a disaster are not very different in terms of trauma that one receives. And in occasions, both of them, collide, or they emerge together. Of course, war creates humanitarian disaster as well. Two things I would like to share. Once I was covering this Kashmir earthquake in 2005, and there was this double-story home. It's a mountainous area, so the first ground floor was really like a basement. So the upper floor, the roof crashed, and the entire thing came down. One child was stuck half outside on the road, and the rest of the body was inside, and his grandmother was alive inside. It's about 4 o'clock in the evening, 3 days after the attack, I guess. It resulted in aftershocks. And for me, the crisis was that there were dogs coming and to eat, of course. So that was we were two, my TV camera person and myself, and driver was there as well. We were not sure what to do. He wanted to take pictures. I wanted to sort of pull the body, and nothing we could do. We could just build a wall of, collect some debris and cover it up. But that really didn't go away from my mind for so many days, and I would eat and vomit. So that kind of stress and that kind of question as to whether you are a humanitarian worker or you are a journalist or you can do both, and how do you cope with it? For photographers, you file a picture. I'm not trying to undermine somebody, but then your work is probably done. You have to send it. For somebody who has to write a script, write a story, the work is not done when you experience it in the field. So that's kind of, an added stress. The other incident was in Afghanistan, southern Afghanistan. There was drought. On the way to the drought, for the first 2 days we had water, and somehow we were generous sharing it, and 14 hours one had to go without water and still had to cover drought. And that was really a very different situation, to be in. So just this aspect of those who are not taking pictures are equally traumatized. And having covered all this terrorism and Syria and also some part of Benghazi, I feel I can't see the movies, American movies in particular. I go for animated movies. Even if an animated character is killing another one, that doesn't affect me. But if bullets are being fired, somebody is being injured, and I know it's a scene I'm going to see the guy in the next movie, I will still not be having the stomach to really go through the experience.
Thank you so much for sharing this. Of course, by inviting two photographers, we didn't mean to say that reporters in general are not affected. And we didn't even talk about how to deal with protagonists, with people who are traumatized, like the people you met after the earthquake. This could fill another panel, I'm sure. There were some other questions. I'm happy to take them, please.
Hi, thank you very much for sharing this experience with us. It's really, I know how difficult that is to speak in front of strangers about your personal feelings. My name is Malak Hassan. I'm a journalist based in Palestine, Ramallah. And I noticed through your discussion that you were speaking about your experience as journalists covering other conflicts. So my question is about you being invested in that place. So I cover the Palestinian conflict. I'm Palestinian. I've lived there for my whole life. So it's difficult to disengage from your environment. You never do, because when I go cover a story or I go cover a death of someone, I have to go back to my house in Palestine and still see the people that I cover their story, and I still have to live the conflict. And I can't, be objective because I am affected at the same time. So how can you do that? Because personally, I feel that, with time, I've been doing this for 7 years now. I feel that I am more stressed as a journalist, and I feel like I've lost hope. I don't see the beauty of words, the beauty of journalism as I used to. Even the photographs, they look to me less kind of impactful as it used to be before I started this job. So what is your kind of maybe advice or like ideas, thoughts about this? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, a great question. And it speaks to lots of different things. So one of the advantages of journalists who don't live in a place is that they can go to a safe place afterwards. The other thing is that we talk about PTSD, it's the idea of post-traumatic stress disorder, and you can only get a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder when the trauma is post. So it has to be a certain period of coming back and not doing well, because we'd expect people to kind of to be able to kind of recover their balance and poise. But it's very tricky in situations in which there's violence happening all around to even use that framework of discussing things, because the violence is ongoing so much. Is that when does it make sense not to be jumpy and not to be affected by what you're doing? I think that probably the solution is to think about not absolute safety, but kind of relative safety. So in other words, think, well, you know, if I'm here or if I'm doing this, this is going to be very challenging and very arousing. Where can I find somewhere or some place or something that's less intense, that takes you away from the kind of primary feeling? And then to be very clear about self-care and doing the things we're talking about, like exercising and eating well, and trying to reframe issues. So it's very easy to become, when there's a lot of bad stuff around, to kind of do what the psychologists call negative cascading. It means that you think one negative thing and then another negative thing, and it can be really like, you know, churning kind of thing. So then the question is what would give more meaning? And it might not be looking at other journalism or looking at journalism or photographs. It might be literature or poetry or keeping a journal or writing or something, that finding something else that feels more life affirming. I mean, I know that's not a very good answer in some ways, but it is notable that there are a number of people, like for instance Nelson Mandela and other people who are in extremely awful situations, who use these kinds of techniques, and particularly reframing techniques, to connect to their kind of, you know, moral sense of what's right and support themselves. So that's possibly one thing to look at, but it's a lot to do.
No, actually about your feeling that after 7 years doing this job, you feel that you have less hope, or I feel the same, and I just explain it because maybe we were a little more utopist and believe a little bit more about, I don't know, piece of word, and the fact that you covered that for many years. I mean, you see the word, you know exactly, and I guess, I don't know, I do feel the same. And even sometimes when I take my pictures, I'm like, okay, and what? And then what? So even after Ukraine, I spent 7 months, and at the end, I was watching about my work, and I was like, okay, and so what? I have guys, dead people, guys with gun, and so what? It's gonna be the same images, country from country. So I don't know. It's what we were talking about.
Sure,
maybe
but
a new way to.
I actually see it differently. I think if someone does journalism to change the world, per se, I mean, it's gonna burn out. If you realize, I'm not talking about you, but if one person realizes that reality is shaped by a million different things, and you might be a small part of it. I mean, not even politicians do really change the world per se. I mean, the world is just so complex that no one really does. So I don't know. I actually do. I am quite positive. I do feel that images do affect us. It's just that a lot of the times we're not, you know, outside those iconic images, we still. Images and video and words do affect us, but we're just not as aware of them. But they just create the persona that we are. I regurgitate things that I read, you know, 15 years ago without really realizing that I did read them, but they're still part of me. Just the fact that I can't quote the article doesn't mean that the article is useless. I do think that we play a super important role, and I think your work, especially being Palestinian, is super important. Like not way important, but just, you know, on a just different from what international journalists do. Sometimes you do need an international journalist to come in. Like in Mexico, local journalists are threatened so much that if they write high, they might be killed. So it requires a foreigner with less personal ties to the country to go in and say, he's doing this, he's doing that, because that person doesn't feel the repercussion because his family is not living next door. But on the other hand, the most interesting, compelling, investigative stories are always done by local people that, know name, surname, know the language, the body language. So I think this opposition between international and local should more be seen as sort of complementary rather than opposition.
But it's for sure a challenge for locals to stay sensitive, alert, and not get numb, because you've just seen so much violence. There were other questions. I saw Fernando.
Well,
yeah.
Hi, my name is Fernando. I'm a Mexican photographer. But I work. Sorry if I kind of affect now, because I have worked as well in conflict zones. Now I'm working as a photo editor here in Germany. So everything that you said, just it's like, yes, I have photographed dead bodies, being in jail, put in jail, because my work, colleagues of mine have been murdered in Mexico, for example. But what you said, I was really surprised. I was in Berlin, and I just was, I think, Friday, and I just was dealing with German news, and suddenly came bombing pictures. I mean, pictures from a bombing in Syria, and I was in shock. I was really in shock because you're in Berlin in a really nice office, and I was really like, why is this happening to me? Because I have been in the front. I know how it is, but I couldn't sleep at that night. And I think this issue affects us. As a photographer, I have experienced it. As an editor, I experienced it. Coming from a country who actually, I was in a workshop with people journalists from the Gulf, and we were discussing, freedom expression there. You go to jail, and say like, well, at least you go to jail. In my country, you disappear, and maybe not just disappear. I was working in South Sudan, and people ask like, why you are going to South Sudan and you don't go to Mexico? I say like, well, my family is not in South Sudan, because I put in risk my family if I work in Mexico. So I think I really appreciate that is this kind of spaces to talk about this, and I think we have to rethink the industry. Because now I'm on the desk talking to you as a photographer, and I'm tired. I cannot offer you what I would like to offer you. I have to say, and you are right, I'm thinking about many other stories. You are one of them. Before I was the story, So I think we have to open, not right now, but really to talk about this, because I don't know how long we can stand this, to be honest. Coming young photographers, not well paid, and of course they will come, but I don't know if you want to make a living from this. Nowadays it's really, really difficult. So I appreciate your words and your experience, and well, keep going, but to be honest, we have to think this as everybody who are seeing this, not seeing us like, oh, you are my, not enemy, but like the concurrents, the opponent. So we are together here, and well, thank you very much.
Thank you for this comment. I'm so very sorry that we won't have time to take another question, but I would invite you, because I saw you were raising your hand, to address our guests personally. But before, I would invite all of you to go outside with us, because the Director General of Deutsche Welle is just opening your exhibition with your photographs outside. The exhibition is called Conflict. So let's go out together and have a look at those impressive pictures. Thanks for being here, thanks for listening to us, and thanks for sharing your stories.
Can I just say very, very quickly that there are lots of resources, including resources about handling traumatic imagery on the Dart Centre website, so if that would be useful to folk, do have a look.
There are actually some printouts somewhere that we prepared, so for you to take away. I guess they're also outside. Thank you very much.